while also thinking about, what the thing in front of me means to me and what it could potentially mean to somebody else, dependent upon context and the way that I present it, the things that I say that it means to me when I'm showing other people. My path into the fine arts was not linear, neither was my exploration in photography. Kind of always been interested in the arts. My uncle Ian used to be kind of a pretty prolific illustrator, and I was always really inspired by him. When I was younger, we would always kind of sit down and just draw together, and he would always, anytime I would think of something, I would ask him to draw it for me, and he would spend hours on this beautiful illustration, and then I would kind of try and copy it in my own style. So I really got into illustration and drawing, have ADHD, so anytime I was in class, I'd be doodling pretty much nonstop. That interest led into printmaking. So I was really getting into printmaking like my sophomore year. After I kind of got really comfortable with printmaking, I decided to continue to dabble, and I took my first black and white film photography class. And I just had so much fun in the darkroom, and I think my interest in printmaking really influenced that. The amount of control that you have in the silver printing process. As time went on, I kind of stopped taking all of these other classes in different media and started focusing more heavily on photography. Photography is so integral to my life. I find myself bringing a camera with me pretty much everywhere I go, and a lot of times I don't really have an idea for what I'm going to photograph before I start photographing. Also approach photography from a more conceptual standpoint. Almost all of the photographs for my MFA thesis I've sketched out. Like, I want this person in this place, like with this prop, and I want the light to be coming in from this direction. And gum bichromate was kind of this photographic technique that ultimately was beat out by silver processes, kind of invented in Europe in the mid-1800s, along the same time that a lot of other things like platinum, palladium, cyanotype were coming up. And I kind of specifically chose this process because of its association with the pictorialist and photosecessionist movement. And these were kind of the guys that looked at photography in the way that it was being perceived as a scientific medium and decided that it had more potential than that. It wasn't just objective, it could be subjective and it could be beautiful. But this process was really only kind of explored in Europe. So I'm kind of taking it and using it, kind of appropriating it to express my identity and my visual history and inserting myself into that history. And also just because aesthetically I think it's reminiscent of memory and time and the effects that time has on memory. Gum bichromate is it can be intimidating. I mean, it's not the hardest alternative photographic process. I think it's still pretty accessible. You just have to be willing to give it a lot of time and do a lot of troubleshooting. But from start, pretty much any paper that you want to print on, you'll have to size it, which is basically a hardening process that prevents the pigments from soaking too far into the paper base. And then I start printing. And when I'm printing, I have to have a digital negative that I work from because it's a contact printing process. So I'm taking my images into Photoshop and splitting them into 4 color channels, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and formatting a little bit so I can keep track of which layer is which, adding registration marks on it so I can line everything up, printing out the digital negatives on transparency film through Photoshop, and then I'm taking the 2 main chemical components, which is gum arabic and ammonium dichromate. And ammonium dichromate is the photosensitive material. Gum arabic is just to adhere it to the surface of the paper. I'm taking those at a 1-to-1 ratio. Typically, I think for a print this size, I'm using about 10 milliliters of each. And then I'm mixing in watercolor pigment from a tube that corresponds to the color of the layer that I'm going to be printing. Mixing that all together while wearing a mask and goggles and gloves, just to avoid dying.
Got a million warnings. I thought I poisoned myself last year when I was doing this, but I think I was just really tired. I just started like feeling kind of dizzy and my eyesight was like a little faint, and I just got really worried because I probably wasn't wearing gloves as much as I should have been.
And then I have a foam brush that I'm using to coat the surface of the paper with the chemistry. And then I have to wait for the chemistry on the paper to dry. Typically I'm using a film dryer to get it really dry because I was running into a lot of issues with the ambient humidity in the building that we print in. And once it's really dry, then I'm sandwiching the digital negative on top of the paper, taping it down. And then using an exposure unit. And then after the print is exposed, I'm just submerging it in a hot water bath. Usually I like to get the water to be about 90 to 100 degrees, but you don't want it too hot, otherwise it can kind of destroy some of the finer details. If the water's too cold, it'll take forever to wash, so it's just finding that perfect balance. Submerging it in the water long enough for the excess dichromate to kind of come out of the print, moving it into a fresh bath, and just letting it sit for like 10 to 20 minutes. And at that point, the emulsion is like really soft on the surface, so you can't handle it too much. And if you agitate it too much at that point, you can kind of rub some of the images away. And after that, usually it's done. I hang it up on the drying rack, and then I have one layer completed. So then I start over completely and do everything again 3 more times at least until the print's finished. But gum is kind of cool in that you can kind of make as many layers on top of them as you want. So, you know, for example, some of these I'm revisiting, and if they're too warm or too cool, I'm adding another layer of blue to cool them down, or another layer of yellow to warm them up, and then just kind of sealing it off with another black layer on top. I was making kind of some 5x7 prints before this to test the images out and see how they would look in the process. And some of those I was making like 9 or 10 layers on each print before I decided that they were done. Yeah, that's about it. Along with the rest of my work, this is kind of my Americanized interpretation of a Philippine folk dance called tinikling, very commonly practiced. But you basically have 2 big bamboo poles. You're kind of clacking them on the ground and together rhythmically, typically with some Spanish-influenced folk music, and then it's kind of a game and a dance. So that print is entitled Mga Panakot, which means spices. One way that I think our culture is really well preserved is in the tradition we have of pig roasting. So when my grandfather was living in rural Cebu with my family in this small village called Borbon, he had just finished medical school and was kind of looking for ways to pay the bills, because in rural Cebu, you know, there were not a lot of people who had the money to pay for medical services. So one of the things that he did was get together with his friends, and they would roast whole pig on a spit, butcher the meat, and then take it to the city to sell. And kind of the process of roasting the pig is pretty involved. It takes pretty much all day. You know, we get up at 8 a.m., prep the pig, eat it alongside a bunch of Filipino side dishes like pancit, lumpia, things like that. But we do it every single summer, and you know, that time that I spend with my grandfather when we're roasting the pig is kind of the time that I learned the most about, you know, his life history and what it means to be Filipino. So I have a lot of photographs revolving around that act of roasting a pig. My family's history is one that you wouldn't read about in a book. but it's something that I've lived and that they've lived, and I think is kind of not typical, but you know, a broad range of people in the Philippines have experienced that have kind of been erased just because of these pre-existing photographic narratives. You know, how people historically utilize the camera as a way to subjugate in other people with the specific goal of colonization in mind, you know, and how that's kind of influenced the way that like Eurocentric communities around the world view communities of color, indigenous peoples, and what can we do as people of color or members of the diaspora to kind of turn the tides and subvert that and kind of provide a more authentic vision of our people and our culture. When my grandparents die, you know, they're the only ones left in my family, my immediate family, the family that's here, that speaks Cebuano. Like, who's going to be there to cook the food that they cook, to speak the language that they speak, to organize us and direct us in the way that their traditions dictate? And if we don't take the time to sit down with them and learn about our own culture, then it's just not going to be preserved. So just kind of having these photographs as a visual record, and you know, also just to be able to share that with everybody else so they can see, you know, what it's all about for us.